In the winter of 1942, inside the shattered ruins of Stalingrad, an entire German army waited for supplies that would never come. Encircled by Soviet forces and cut off from the outside world, the German Sixth Army depended on a single promise, one made at the very highest level of the Nazi leadership. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had assured Adolf Hitler that his aircraft could supply the trapped army entirely by air. It was a bold claim, delivered with confidence and authority. At the time, it sounded like a solution. In reality, it would become one of the most disastrous miscalculations of World War II. The crisis began in November 1942, when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive designed to break the German hold on Stalingrad. Instead of attacking the heavily defended German troops inside the city, the Soviets targeted the weaker Romanian and Axis units guarding the flanks. The breakthrough was immediate and devastating. Soviet armored units smashed through the lines and advanced rapidly behind German positions. Within days, the encirclement was complete. On November 23rd, the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was fully surrounded. What had once been an aggressive offensive had suddenly turned into a desperate fight for survival. Inside the pocket, the situation deteriorated with alarming speed. The German army had not prepared for a prolonged siege. Supplies were already limited, and now they were critically low. Food had to be rationed, fuel was nearly gone, and ammunition was carefully conserved. The brutal Russian winter made everything worse. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and many soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite became widespread. Vehicles froze in place. The wounded filled makeshift field hospitals that quickly ran out of medical supplies. Every day without resupply pushed the army closer to collapse. Despite the severity of the situation, Adolf Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. He insisted that Stalingrad must be held at all costs. The city carried enormous symbolic value. Capturing a city that bore Stalin's name was meant to be a defining victory for Germany. To abandon it was unthinkable in Hitler's view. Instead, he demanded a solution that would allow the Sixth Army to hold its position without retreating. That solution came from Hermann Göring. Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the entire Sixth Army by air. He claimed that German transport aircraft could deliver the food, fuel, and ammunition needed to sustain the encircled forces. His confidence was based on earlier, smaller-scale airlift operations that had succeeded under far less demanding conditions. But Stalingrad was different. The scale was far greater, the weather far harsher, and the risks significantly higher. The Sixth Army required hundreds of tons of supplies every single day to remain combat effective. Meeting that demand would push the Luftwaffe to its absolute limits. Hitler accepted Göring's promise without hesitation. The decision was final. The Sixth Army would remain in Stalingrad and be supplied entirely by air. It was a moment that would define the outcome of the battle. As the first transport missions were prepared, the German High Command believed they had found a way to hold their ground. But the reality of what was about to unfold would prove far more brutal and far more unforgiving than anyone had anticipated. As the airlift began, the reality of Göring's promise was tested almost immediately. The Luftwaffe was now tasked with supplying an entire army trapped deep inside enemy territory. The scale of the operation was enormous. The Sixth Army required at least 600 to 700 tons of supplies every single day just to remain operational. That included food, ammunition, fuel, and medical equipment. But from the very first days, it became clear that the Luftwaffe could not meet these demands. On most days, the delivered supplies fell far below what was needed. Often, less than 100 tons reached Stalingrad. Some days, almost nothing arrived at all. Several factors made the situation nearly impossible. The distance between supply bases and Stalingrad was significant, forcing aircraft to fly long routes over hostile territory. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft defenses posed a constant threat. At the same time, winter conditions severely disrupted operations. Thick fog, heavy snowfall, and freezing temperatures reduced visibility and made navigation extremely difficult. Aircraft were frequently delayed, forced to turn back, or crashed while attempting to land. Inside the pocket, airfields were damaged, overcrowded, and often under fire, making both landing and takeoff extremely dangerous. The Luftwaffe also faced a shortage of suitable transport aircraft. Many of the planes used were outdated or already worn from previous operations. Bombers were hastily converted into transport planes, but they were not designed to carry heavy cargo. Mechanical failures became common in the extreme cold, and maintenance crews struggled to keep aircraft operational. Every lost plane further reduced the Luftwaffe's capacity to deliver supplies. Pilots and crews were pushed to their limits, flying repeated missions under constant pressure and increasing risk. Inside Stalingrad, the consequences were immediate and severe. Food shortages became critical, and soldiers were placed on minimal rations. Starvation began to weaken entire units. Fuel shortages meant that vehicles and heavy weapons could no longer be used effectively. Ammunition had to be conserved, limiting the Army's ability to defend its positions. The wounded suffered the most. Medical supplies were almost non-existent, and field hospitals were overwhelmed. Many soldiers died from wounds that could have been treated under normal conditions. Despite these realities, reports sent to Hitler painted a more optimistic picture. Göring continued to insist that the airlift was functioning and that the situation was under control. Hitler accepted these assurances and refused to authorize a breakout. The order remained unchanged. The Sixth Army was to hold its position at all costs. On the ground, however, commanders like General Paulus understood the truth. Without a reliable supply line, the Army could not survive indefinitely. As the days turned into weeks, the gap between Göring's promise and the reality on the ground became impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe was not sustaining the Army, it was barely keeping it alive. And even that would not last much longer. By December 1942, the situation inside Stalingrad had reached a critical breaking point. The airlift was no longer just insufficient, it was failing completely. Daily supply levels continued to fall, while the needs of the Sixth Army grew more desperate. Soldiers were now surviving on starvation rations, often receiving little more than a piece of bread a day. Horses were slaughtered for food, and even that supply quickly ran out. Weakness spread through the ranks, reducing combat effectiveness and destroying morale. What had once been a powerful, well-equipped army was slowly deteriorating into a starving, exhausted force. At the same time, the Soviet grip around the pocket tightened. Defensive positions were reinforced, and Soviet artillery continuously bombarded German-held areas. Any attempt to improve airfield conditions or organize supply distribution became increasingly difficult under constant fire. The main airfields inside the pocket, such as Potomnik and Gumrak, became lifelines. but also targets. Soviet forces understood their importance and focused attacks on disabling them. As these airfields were damaged or lost, the Luftwaffe's ability to deliver supplies declined even further. Outside the encirclement, German command attempted to organize a rescue operation. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm in December 1942, an effort to break through Soviet lines and reach the trapped Sixth Army. For a moment, it appeared that a relief might be possible. German forces advanced toward Stalingrad and came within a relatively short distance of the pocket. Inside the city, many officers believed this was their only chance to escape. But the Sixth Army had no fuel left for a breakout, and Hitler refused to authorize any attempt to move out. The army was ordered to hold its position and wait. This decision proved devastating. Without coordination between the relief forces and the trapped army, Operation Winter Storm began to lose momentum. Soviet resistance intensified, and the advancing German units were eventually forced to halt and withdraw. The Sixth Army remained encircled, with no realistic hope of being rescued. The failure of the relief effort marked a turning point. From that moment on, the fate of the army was no longer uncertain. It was sealed. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe continued its efforts, but the situation in the air had become even more dangerous. Soviet air power increased, intercepting German transport planes and shooting many of them down. Losses mounted rapidly. Experienced crews were killed, and aircraft became increasingly scarce. The airlift, which had been presented as a reliable solution, was now collapsing under pressure from every direction. Each passing day reduced its effectiveness even further. It was during this period that the truth became impossible to deny. The numbers no longer supported Göring's claims. The Luftwaffe simply could not deliver the required supplies. Reports from the front made it clear that the army was starving, ammunition was running out, and medical care had broken down completely. Even within the German high command, doubts began to grow. What had once been a confident promise was now exposed as an impossible task. For Göring, this was the moment of realization. The plan he had presented with certainty had failed. The airlift would not save the Sixth Army. Stalingrad could no longer be supplied. But by the time this reality became clear, it was already too late to change the outcome. By January 1943, the situation inside Stalingrad had become hopeless. The Sixth Army was no longer capable of sustained combat. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion had reduced entire units to shadows of their former strength. Soldiers were too weak to fight effectively, many unable to stand for long periods, let alone hold defensive positions. Ammunition stocks were nearly gone, and heavy weapons had fallen silent due to lack of fuel. The army that had once driven deep into Soviet territory was now trapped, freezing, and slowly collapsing from within. The fall of the last operational airfields sealed the army's fate. Pitomnik, the primary airfield, fell to Soviet forces in mid-January. Shortly after, Gumrak, its final replacement, was also lost. With no functioning airstrips left, the Luftwaffe could no longer land aircraft inside the pocket. Supplies could only be dropped by parachute, and even that was wildly inaccurate and insufficient. Much of the cargo landed in Soviet-held areas or was lost entirely. Whatever hope remained of maintaining even minimal supply levels disappeared almost overnight. As the Red Army tightened its encirclement, Soviet forces launched a final offensive to eliminate the pocket entirely. The German Sixth Army was split into smaller groups, isolated from one another and unable to coordinate any form of organized defense. Communication broke down, and command structures began to collapse. General Friedrich Paulus, now promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler, received clear instructions: do not surrender. The promotion carried an unspoken message. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The expectation was that Paulus would fight to the end or take his own life. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, the final days were marked by chaos and desperation. Soldiers searched for food among destroyed buildings, fought over dwindling supplies, and tried to survive in conditions that had become unbearable. The wounded were abandoned, with no means of evacuation or treatment. Temperatures remained brutally low, and shelter was limited. Every hour brought new losses. The army was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting simply to survive. On January 31st, 1943, the inevitable happened. General Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces in the southern pocket of Stalingrad. Days later, the remaining northern forces also capitulated. What remained of the Sixth Army, once one of Germany's most powerful formations, was gone. Tens of thousands were dead, and tens of thousands more were taken into captivity. It was one of the greatest defeats in German military history. The fall of Stalingrad marked a decisive turning point in the war. Göring's promise had not only failed, it had contributed directly to the destruction of an entire army. The belief that the Luftwaffe could sustain such an operation had been proven disastrously wrong. From this moment forward, the balance of power on the Eastern Front began to shift permanently against Germany. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad sent shockwaves through the German High Command. What had been presented as a controlled and manageable situation had ended in total disaster. For Hermann Göring, the consequences were severe. His confident promise to supply the army by air had been proven completely unrealistic. The Luftwaffe had failed to deliver even a fraction of what was required, and in doing so had contributed directly to one of Germany's greatest defeats. While Göring publicly avoided blame, the loss of credibility within the leadership was undeniable. For Adolf Hitler, the defeat marked a turning point in both strategy and mindset. Despite the scale of the disaster, he refused to accept the reality of the situation. Rather than adjusting his approach, Hitler doubled down on his belief that German forces must hold their ground at all costs. The idea of retreat became increasingly unacceptable, even when it was the only logical option. This rigid thinking would lead to further losses in the months and years that followed. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It exposed a critical flaw in German decision-making at the highest level. On the Eastern Front, the impact was immediate and irreversible. The Red Army seized the momentum and began a series of offensives that would push German forces steadily westward. The balance of power had shifted. Germany was no longer dictating the pace of the war. Instead, it was reacting, defending, and slowly losing ground. The psychological effect was just as significant. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. Both the Soviet Union and the Allies now understood that Nazi Germany could be defeated. The failure of the Stalingrad airlift also changed how military planners viewed the limits of air supply. What Göring had promised was not entirely impossible in theory, but the scale and conditions made it unworkable in practice. Weather, distance, enemy resistance, and limited aircraft capacity all combined to make sustained air supply on that level unrealistic. Stalingrad became a lasting example of how overconfidence and poor planning could lead to catastrophic results. It highlighted the dangers of making strategic decisions based on optimism rather than logistical reality. In the end, the story of Stalingrad is not only about a battle, but about a decision to rely on a promise that could not be fulfilled. Göring believed the Luftwaffe could achieve the impossible. Hitler chose to trust that belief rather than adapt to the situation, and an entire army paid the price. The moment Göring realized Stalingrad could no longer be supplied did not change the outcome. By then, the fate of the Sixth Army had already been sealed. Stalingrad remains one of the most powerful reminders of World War II. It shows how quickly confidence can turn into catastrophe, and how a single miscalculation at the highest level can destroy even the strongest forces. It was not just a defeat. It was a collapse that reshaped the entire course of the war.